Chapter 316, New Missions. Dumbledore and the rest's eyes lit up with interest at that news, since this was a very novel and interesting idea that affected many fields of study. For potions there was many a brew that required a specific set of moonlight as well as certain lunar or solar phenomena to finish. For transfiguration the animagus ritual itself as well as a few others used lunar or solar energies to perform. Plants need not be mentioned in this regard, while charms and alchemy fell in the same category as transfiguration and potions in the need for those specific conditions. Nick didn't hesitate to take a small piece of the light material from his realm to show them what he meant. This is the unshaped solar magic material, feel free to run some tests on it, he said while placing it on the headmaster's desk. Each of the academics eagerly pulled off a piece of the material to run their own tests on the stuff. What an unusual material, it appears hard yet is soft and malleable to the touch while simultaneously seeming to be pure magic, Dumbledore said, fascinated with the sample he had. The other academics were no better, as they each tested it in various ways, with Snape's test having the most volatile results by far. Apparently he placed a tiny amount of the material in a vial and mixed in some sort of clear potion that caused the material to break down and turn the potion orange and yellow before the mixture turned violent from the now formless energy of the material, causing an explosion of purifying and anti-evil energies. Everyone was unharmed with the exception of himself, that now had a terrible burn on his arm where the dark mark used to be. Yes, the dark mark was completely gone from him, which made his face go extremely pale. Nick could not blame him either, as Voldemort was not likely to be happy about this when he figured out what had happened. See, the magic of the mark was of the permanently affixed sort that was tied to the life of a single individual. This meant that the only thing theoretically able to remove the mark was that individual, or something capable of totally cutting the connection of the mark to them. Voldemort used the mark to track and message his followers, so if one of them betrayed him they can't hide from his wrath. If the mark could be removed, however, he would lose that leverage, which was unacceptable to a controlling individual like him. When Snape inevitably returns to the man to get a new mark, he will need to tell what it was that caused the mark to vanish. Snape basically had no choice but to spill the beans about Nick's new material. With that, I believe we should call this meeting to an end, Dumbledore said, as his good mood was now ruined with the unfortunate repercussions of this event. Nick could only chuckle awkwardly, since technically this situation could be considered his fault to a degree. To be fair though, how was he supposed to know that the material turns into an anti-evil grenade after losing cohesion? Still, it wasn't all bad news though, as he at least learned something new thanks to this happening. Time began to pass by after that, and as per the agreement, Nick went through the exams early, much to Hermione's envy. She was more advanced than the rest of their year as well, but not by as wide a margin as Nick, and she lacked the ability to really be of use in the battles ahead, and as such did not get the same offer. This unfortunately meant that she was going to fall even further behind Nick, as he now had much more free time to spend studying. The biggest thing that happened, however, was that the moment Nick finished the last exam he received 2 missions from the system. Mission conditions established. Description: hardship lurks around the corner and you've promised aid in exchange for exemption from all classes, time to fulfill your end of the bargain. Objectives: create 250,000 rings of protection, create a large variety of offensive rings in bulk, optional, create a full set of rare tier armor, optional. Rewards: Space and U, book, Song of Shields, book, optional, 1x crafting method ticket, optional. Status: incomplete. Mission conditions established. Description: you have promised Lupin to turn his curse into a blessing, so do it. Objectives: fix the flawed parts of the curse, publicize the method used, optional, improve upon the foundation of the curse to create a magical wolf animagus, optional. Rewards: 3x item tickets of beasts and men, book, optional, Daedra Heart. Status: incomplete. Chapter 317, The Grind. Nick was surprised by these 2 missions popping up, but was more than happy to take them on. The first one was obviously going to take quite some time to fulfill, since that amount of rings was no simple amount. To put it into perspective, he could at the moment make 20 rings of protection before he needed to refill his energy stores. He could also only refill his energy stores 3 times a day. This meant that if he focused only on making those rings of protection he could make 60 of them per day. At that rate it would take him nearly 20 years to complete this mission, which was clearly unacceptable to him. Thankfully he had a few options to increase his crafting ability dramatically to shorten that time frame greatly. He could accept the mission taking 2 or even 3 years to complete at his current speed of crafting, but 20 was too much. The options he had available to him at the moment was to figure out how to automate the crafting process for the rings so he could churn them out at a much faster pace, the ritual of breath, creating an energy reservoir, and generally mastering his style of crafting even further. The first option is too time consuming, so that's out for now. I can definitely complete the ritual thanks to Helena's modification of it. Creating a reservoir is also fairly possible, but then I would need to convince others to donate mana while also somehow purifying it for my own consumption. As for mastering the style further, that's basically a joke since I already have nearly 90% mastery of it, and that last 10% is really only being held back by my lack of power spiritually, he thought seriously while messing with some of the sun's light material in his realm. The realm doesn't directly increase his power at all, but gave the unique benefit of boosting his understanding of whatever happened or existed within it by stupidly high levels. The downside to this was that this understanding was on the micro scale when focused, so he couldn't use this to basically download the entire library's content into his head at once. The reason for this was that the words written on the pages of books was apparently in the sweet spot of normal perception that the realm didn't cover. That said, it was perfect for his experiments as it allowed him to figure out what each small change he made did. Yet I think that ritual is probably my best option at the moment, he thought as he condensed the sun material into a dagger with a smile. The sun's light material had a strong proclivity towards weaponry, so with the help of his realm Nick had figured out how to change the stuff into other forms besides the arrows, but only other weapons so far. Still, progress was progress, and he was more than happy with what he was getting. Leaving the realm, Nick sighed as he found Dumbledore waiting for him in the workshop. The old man was admiring the astral hammer and anvil he had at the moment, so he didn't notice Nick return to the real world. "What can I help you with, Professor?" Nick asked, startling the man slightly. "These items here are simply fascinating, my boy. Can you tell me where you got them from?" the old man asked curiously. "They came from myself, of course. I based them off of a mysterious place I found before school last year," Nick said casually. Dumbledore looked enlightened after hearing this. So that was what happened at that time. Nico and I were wondering where the craftsman who entered the astral realm vanished to," the old man said, leaving Nick dumbfounded. "You entered that place shortly after creating your crafting and enchanting method, correct?" Dumbledore asked with smile after seeing Nick's expression. "I thought," Nick started before Dumbledore finished the statement, "that the astral realm was something only you knew about?" "Sorry to say you are both wrong and right at the same time," he said with a sad sigh. "It's a legendary place that all true experts in the crafting community are aware of, but has strict requirements to enter. You likely only managed to enter because you created something totally new and the realm acknowledged it. Judging from the time frame you entered, I assume you didn't leave an imprint on the realm to return at will?" Dumbledore asked, and Nick nodded in confirmation. "A pity, but to be expected, I suppose. Nico will be quite disheartened by the news. He was very much looking forward to meeting someone else with access to that place, you know. If it's not too much trouble, could I by chance purchase an item like these two from you? I believe they merit study," the old goat requested. Chapter 318, Event. This request caught Nick off guard but was fairly easy to fulfill, so he simply nodded. "Give me a bit of time and I should be able to get another hammer to you. Consider it an early Christmas gift," he said, and the old man smiled happily. While Nick may not like the old man, he was also aware that having him at his back was worth doing, since after the mana concentration increases he will likely quickly grow more powerful. Nick wasn't stupid enough to think that someone like Dumbledore was unaware of how to take that step to the next rank. A rank 5 wizard on his side will come in handy at the early stages of the world's recovery when the gods haven't been unsealed yet. After that though, Nick doubted that the old man was going to survive very long at all. Dumbledore was not the sort of person to shy away from a fight with a tyrannical powerhouse, and as a result would likely confront Zeus, which definitely won't end well for the old goat. There was no way in hell that Zeus wasn't flat out bad news for the world on a scale that the likes of Voldemort could only have wet dreams about. Nick wasn't sure how Grindelwald would play out the future though, since the only thing he knew about was the flooding the planet in Mana plan, but the rest was totally blank. "We have gotten off topic it seems," Dumbledore said with a chuckle. "Yes we have. Speaking of, what is it I can help you with today?" Nick asked curiously, since he couldn't think of a reason for the old man's visit. "I have received a rather interesting opportunity that I felt you may appreciate given your unique situation," Dumbledore said mysteriously. "Which part of my situation exactly?" Nick asked while trying to figure out what the opportunity the old man may be talking about was. He couldn't help but curse at how little the world beyond Harry was explained in the books as he drew a blank. The real magical world was many times more complicated and detailed than the stuff mentioned in the books, to the point of even being misleading. Sure, the real thing was way more magical than portrayed, but it was also a million times more dangerous as well. To be specific, I am referring to your familiar in this case. You see, every year Beauxbatons Academy of Magic hosts a competition of sorts with grand prizes to the top 3. Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eyes that confused Nick. "What does that have to do with Nazgul?" he asked, interested. "Everything, my boy. You see, the competition is a magical beast beauty pageant that the school uses to inspire the fashion industry in France. It also doubles as a good way to introduce new magical creatures to the world safely," the old goat said with a smirk that Nick shared after seeing the benefits this could bring him. It was hard to ignore the fact that despite being registered in the ministry, Nazgul, who was a ring beast, A/N, that's what I'm calling the species, was a huge unknown to the rest of the world and might cause him problems when he travels about in the future. The trafficking of magical beasts was a seriously regulated and stern matter. If some mistake was made during the paperwork needed to travel to other places, he would be looking at a very hefty fine or even imprisonment, while Nazgul was detained or flat out executed. This beauty pageant would be the perfect way to introduce Nazgul to the wider world so that this problem wouldn't likely happen. "I assume that this pageant is coming up soon since you are here now?" he asked, and Dumbledore nodded. "It begins on the 11th in fact. I wanted to see if you were interested so I could apply for a travel permit for you to the event, as that will take a couple days and it is in 4 days. He explained honestly. "I am indeed quite interested in participating to see what sort of clothes she inspires if nothing else," Nick said with a grin. Dumbledore was already prepared for Nick to show interest in the event and brought the paperwork with him. Nick carefully read through the stuff before signing anything, which Dumbledore could only sigh at. Broken trust is really hard to fix with him, the old man thought as he left to get all this stuff filed away at the ministry. Nick meanwhile took out the diagram for the ritual of breath to look it over. There weren't many changes from the original, but there were a few bits that had been modified. Chapter 319, Ritual of Breath. Nick had long since acquired the lungs of a dragon for this ritual and had thus had literally no reason at all to hold off on it any more now that he had the time to undergo the ritual. He had specifically chosen the lungs of a Swedish short snout for this ritual because it was one of the only dragons to have an unusually attributed flame. Unlike normal flames from a dragon, this species had blue flames that were powerful enough to turn wood and bone to ash in a couple seconds. Nick theorized that this was likely because their lungs had a higher magical concentration than other species and thus hoped it would give him a better result. There were no real preparations needed to perform this ritual other than collecting the ingredients and drawing out the ritual circle. After being allowed to do as she wished freely, Helena had been spending less and less time in the workshop or accompanying Nick lately. Today was no different, as last he checked she was gorging herself silly at Hogsmeade. This absence didn't bother him very much, as he knew that she would return after she had her fill of corporeal life again. Nick locked up the workshop as he left before heading to the 7th floor to use the room of requirement for the ritual. He of course made sure to enter the room in secret, since things would get rather complicated if someone were to enter the room whilst he was there. This time the room was very bland and empty, which was what he had wanted, as he needed a space to draw the ritual circle without any obstacles. The circle itself was consisted of a string of rune words encircling a hexagram that had the lungs placed in the north and south points of the hexagram. Once Nick was done drawing the circle and triple-checking to make sure it was all correct, he stepped into the center and took a deep breath before speaking. Ut spiro draconis pulmo meus. Magia me implete et floriat. As I breathe, let my lungs be those of a dragon. Let magic fill me and flourish. He spoke clearly and concisely, and immediately he felt his magic drain into the ritual circle that began to glow. The lungs quickly dried up and turned to dust as the ritual worked. Before that same dust flew into his nose and mouth. Nick had to resist the urge to gag reflexively as he felt to his knees as a blisteringly hot pain filled his chest. He panted and wisps of blue flame left his mouth as the pain grew more and more intense. During this entire time the ritual circle had never stopped siphoning off his mana, so he was also getting more and more tired as his stores grew lower and lower. After 15 minutes of agony though, Nick sighed in relief as the ritual ended. He tentatively took in a breath and immediately felt the ambient magic get sucked into his nose and assimilated into his body from his lungs. That one breath alone recovered a noticeable amount of mana for him, which excited him. Curious to see if he had any other bonuses from the ritual like the blue flames he let out previously. Taking a deep breath, Nick, instead of absorbing the mana into his body, had his lungs absorb it before breathing out. Heat rose from his throat as the breath came up, and out of his mouth poured a stream of azure flame that scorched the air on contact. He was genuinely confused about this, as he had not read that this ritual gave its caster the properties of the lungs used. This whole test was actually meant as a joke attempt to breath fire, not actually breath the stuff. I have a sneaking suspicion that Helena modified the ritual more than I told her to. Nick thought with sigh as he rubbed his forehead. For now though, he chose to put this matter to the side as he wiped away the evidence of his ritual from the room. A small misconception that many had about the room was that after you leave it resets everything in it. The truth of the matter was that this was half correct, since it did do that, but only after making a magical imprint of that room that could be summoned by whoever later. Nick only learned this thanks to Helena revealing it, or else he would have not cared enough to take the time to wipe out all traces of the ritual. Still, this ritual is good stuff, as in only 30 minutes I've recovered my full reserves, he thought with a smile. Chapter 320, Wolf Howl. If my judgment isn't wrong, then my forging rate has increased by nearly 4 times. This should put me at about 240 rings a day if I focus on it exclusively, meaning I'd now only need about 3 years to complete this mission's main objective. He worked it all out as he left the room that was scrubbed clean of his ritual. The next few days passed by quickly as he constantly churned out rings of protection that he turned over to Dumbledore for the price he sold them for last year. He wasn't wrong about how much of an increase he had experienced in his recovery speed and thus forging rate, as he topped out at the exact number of rings he predicted previously. Though he noticed that the rings he was making were nearly twice as good as the previous iteration. It wasn't hard for him to figure out exactly why that was either. See, the method he used to enchant the rings worked based on his own knowledge and experience with the subject, and he had never stopped working on his understanding of shield spells, which was what caused this change. Even thought the enchantment itself was pretty much the exact same. Still, the day of the full moon finally arrived, and Nick wasted no time at all collecting the various analytic measures he needed to study the changes in Lupin. Amongst these was a ring that worked to create a copy of the wearer's life force signature during a period of time. With this, Nick merely needed to collect the ring from Lupin after the effect was triggered in order to learn how the magic changed the life force of him. The rest was mostly to take skin, hair, and blood samples to compare to a set of the same samples from when Lupin was in his human state. Nick had of course asked for consent before collecting any of these things, since it was only proper. Once the sun started to lower, Dumbledore came personally to take Nick to the location Lupin would transform. He was not surprised to see that it was the Shrieking Shack of all places. As they arrived, they noticed a pale-faced Lupin waiting within nervously. "No need to worry, Professor, I have thoroughly prepared for this event. Could you please put this ring on?" Nick asked with a reassuring smile. "What does it do?" Lupin asked while putting it on. It creates a recording of your life force that I can then analyze later to learn how transforming affects it. Nick explained, since he felt there was no reason to hide it. You truly have prepared well, it would seem. Dumbledore said with a raised eyebrow. I take my work very seriously. Nick said with a grin that seemed to relax Lupin a bit. He couldn't be blamed for being nervous, as he of all people was aware of the danger posed by his werewolf form. That was the cruel part of the curse. The werewolf remembers everything they did while transformed, as if they were a prisoner in their own body. If it makes you feel better, I intend to paralyze you after you transform so I can collect the last samples, so you will be no danger at all to anyone else. Nick added helpfully, and Lupin nodded before it changed into a waiting game. To pass time, Nick chatted with Dumbledore and Lupin on his progress with the Patronus charm. Neither of them were all that surprised that he could use it, since he was studying the animagus transformation, and one's Patronus usually was also their animal form. Dumbledore was more than happy to share a few of the ways he had figured out how to use the spell, from delivering messages to driving off many evil creatures at once. Even Lupin couldn't help but relax and get lured into the conversation. Despite the way he has spent the last decade or so, he was a scholarly sort and loved learning new information. Soon though, he started to groan as the moon's influence called to his curse. Nick stepped away from the man alongside Dumbledore, who drew the Elder Wand and held it at the ready. Bones cracked and shifted as Lupin began to change, but Nick was far more interested in the incredible difference between the active curse and passive one in his magical senses. The passive curse seemed broken but quiet, but the active one was like a car that had the wrong parts installed, as it was louder and far more discordant. He frowned though when he noticed the damage that this transformation was doing to Lupin's body. No wonder werewolves feel terrible after they turn back. Their body is literally tearing itself apart, he thought seriously. Chapter 321, Wolf Howl, 2. Dumbledore watched the scene of Lupin transforming with a sad expression, but didn't allow his mind to fall into the trap of melancholy. Freshly transformed werewolves seemed harmless at first, but the moment they noticed you, it was an instant shift in temperament to a savage and violent one. Nick was also very much aware of this, so when the transformation ended, he wasted no time at all tapping his wand against the floor. The werewolf Lupin was startled as thick metal chains and shackles shot out of the floor and bound each of its limbs in 3 places before wrapping around its muzzle to prevent even the slightest chance of it biting them. Dumbledore waved his wand, adding his own layer of bindings to the struggling creature, preventing any and all movement. Without missing a beat, Nick rushed over and went to work collecting the samples he needed, as well as the ring on Lupin's digit that had served its purpose. We can leave now, since I have all the information I can get without risking my possessions and placing him in my ring for deeper analysis. Nick spoke calmly as he left the growling and snarling creature behind. Dumbledore nodded and waved his hand again, covering Lupin's eyes as they walked out, at which point he quickly removed the restraints on it and locked the door behind him as they left. Nick heard the creature roar angrily and crash against the door in a worrying manner. No need to be concerned. This shack was specially reinforced so as to hold a werewolf during the previous headmaster's time, so the poor students with the curse need not worry about harming others during their monthly transformation. Dumbledore said reassuringly. That is good. A werewolf released in such close proximity to Hogsmeade would be quite bad. Nick said, and the old man nodded seriously. On to a better topic. I just this evening received your travel paperwork for tomorrow. The old goat said before reaching into his robes and taking out a few items. The first was magical passport of sorts with all of his information on it, as well as a magical imprint waiting to be filled by him. This was to make sure that even under Polyjuice it was impossible for someone to travel legally to another country even if they somehow stole his passport. The second item was a card that expanded to show all of his legal paperwork for his travel visas, so that he could just hand over the card when he arrived while showing his passport to legally get welcome to magical France. Nick may not be a huge fan or bureaucracy in general, but he was willing to admit that it had its uses in some cases. Thank you. I imagine you will be operating us to the ministry so we could take the long-distance flight soon. Nick asked, and the old man smiled mischievously. Right now, in fact. He said before grabbing Nick by the arm and operating in an instant. Nick didn't have time to brace himself at all as he felt like he was getting squeezed through a straw belly first. His reflexes may have told him about Dumbledore's movement the moment it started, but the close proximity made dodging impossible. When they landed at their destination, Nick had to fight with his stomach that was threatening revolt at the mistreatment. Dumbledore merely chuckled at his successful prank despite the glare Nick sent him. "I bloody hate apparition," Nick hissed as he steadied himself. "You are certainly not alone in that sentiment, though I personally find the magic quite pleasant," Dumbledore said with a smile. Nick snorted at that before walking into the Ministry building impatiently. Much like Hogwarts, it is impossible to apparate directly into the Ministry in most cases, so they were outside it at the moment. It wasn't late enough for the Ministry to close just yet, so they had no trouble at all getting to use the long-distance flu to France. The flu network was an interesting thing in that it actually had no set distance that it couldn't be used. Thanks to this, each ministry in the world had a long-distance flu that connected to the other ministries alone. Nick found flu travel slightly more bearable than apparition, as instead of feeling like you were getting sucked through a straw by your belly button, it felt more like falling down a really deep hole. The flames were mostly just for opening the way, while the actual travel was fairly peaceful if rather dirty. No matter how clean you were when stepping into the flu, you will always come out the other side with soot and ash on you. Chapter 322, Truth Stranger Than Fiction. The French ministry was very different than the British one in both design and feel, as the British ministry was cold stone and metal that had a serious and unfriendly atmosphere to it. The French ministry, on the other hand, had rich wooden offices built in a vertical manner that circled around the inside of the building, with the exception of 4 large hallways in each directions. The stone was a warm golden marble, while the statues were polished bronze, that all in total made the place way more friendly feeling as far as Nick was concerned. Papers. The brown-haired woman wearing a suit sitting behind a desk next to the flu demanded in a heavily accented English. Nick and Dumbledore handed over the paperwork smoothly, and the woman checked them over carefully. She paused slightly when she got to Dumbledore's paperwork, but snapped out of it quickly and took out a stamp that she tapped on a certain spot of the passports. "Everything is in order, please enjoy your stay," she said, handing the paperwork back much more respectfully this time. "Thank you, we will certainly try," Dumbledore said in French with a smile. "Come along, Nick, we still need to find a room for our stay," the old man said before leading the way. "That's good, Nazgul and Dusk are getting antsy from being cooped up in my ring," Nick said with a chuckle. Dusk needed to be brought along since he both refused to be left behind and was sure to cause trouble if left to his own devices. Steve, on the other hand, was left in the care of Luna and the other girls, who practically jumped at the chance. Even if Nazgul was the favorite of his beast companions, Steve was still adored by everyone. "That reminds me, for whatever reason, but will Fox be joining us?" Nick asked curiously. "Indeed he will, but unlike us, he will be flying to whole way here. It is quite the rare treat for him to make such a long journey, and I couldn't deny him the experience in good conscience," Dumbledore said with a smile. Nick could understand this easily, since even Nazgul liked to stretch her wings on campus when she could. It had caused a rather funny incident, in fact, not long ago, when she joined the Gryffindor team's practice and proved to be a better player than most of the team's members. She was faster, better at flying, had very sharp eyes, and was horribly strong for her size. All of this combined meant she was able to steal the quaffle easily, beat off the bludgers and snatch the snitch before Harry could even see it. Oliver Wood died a little inside that day. Anyways, it didn't take the two of them to leave the ministry, though Nick did see a 2-tailed black cat in it that made him a little uncomfortable. He recognized them from the magical beast encyclopedia that was part of the first-year supply list as Nicomata. These magical creatures were the bane of nearly all wizards, as any magic you hit them with caused them to split into 2 separate Nicomata. They were as such typically used as guards for treasures or information, since they were the living embodiment of the term swarm tactics. Nick knew that this creature was here as a warning to the two of them not to cause any problems, as the creatures rarely left their territory unless instructed to. Dumbledore saw the creature as well, but merely scoffed at it. He couldn't be blamed either, as so long as he wanted to cause problems there was no way the ministry here could stop him, and they knew it, so the warning was stupid. Still, the Ministry of Magic for France was very different than the one for Britain, as it was actually located beneath the Muggle parliamentary building in the middle of Paris. This came as a shock to Nick, to say the least, as this was a ballsy choice to say the least. The entrance and exit to the place was an illusion staircase built into the middle of the floor that had Muggle repellent wards all around it, as well as notice me not charms. Not a single Muggle so much as batted an eye when Nick and Dumbledore seemed to appear out of nowhere. I sometimes wonder if I am the odd one for thinking about it, or if everyone else is the strange ones for not. Nick thought as they moved through the large doors of the building and onto the street. Paris at night time was quite the sight, as the Eiffel Tower was lit up in the distance and various colorful streetlights filled the city as the people in it went about their late evening business. Chapter 323, First Impressions. Now, to find a place to stay for the night, if memory serves, there should be a place not far from here, Dumbledore said casually before starting to walk in a certain direction. Nick could only helplessly follow behind, as he was in a totally different country of which he legitimately knows little about really. If he was dealing with wizards he would be fine, since he was fairly wealthy and spoke fluent French, but with Muggles he knew absolutely nothing about their culture or customs, and wizarding money was useless to them beyond the material value. The old goat seemed to know what he was talking about though, as they soon came across an old-looking hostel with a pub below it that reminded Nick a suspicious amount of the Leaky Cauldron. It was dirty and ill-lit, with various drunk wizards sitting about. Welcome to the Cracked Goblet, foreign friends," the old bartender said, with the first couple words being in French until he keenly noticed we weren't and switched to English. Nick was pretty sure that the barkeep knew who Dumbledore was and thus switched to English, since he was not in any clothes that would give away his nationality. "Look at the stupid Englishman, probably here to sightsee. Damn tourists," one of the tipsy wizards said, not quietly at all in French. "Look at the foolish Frenchman making an ass of himself while wasting his coin on cheap booze." Nick bit back in French, making the whole pub go silent for a moment before bursting into uproarious laughter. Dumbledore raised a surprised eyebrow at Nick. "I wasn't aware you knew French," he with a curious undertone. Nick smirked. "I have a bit of talent at learning new languages, so I picked it up in my free time along with several others," he said, playing it off easily. "You've got a sharp tongue, brat. Have a slice of pie on me," the tipsy wizard said with a laugh before tossing a galleon to the barkeep. It was at this point Nick realized the sort of people French folk probably were. They were probably passionate and brave people that wore their hearts on their sleeves and loved a good verbal sparring. Still, Nick wasn't one to turn down free calories and happily accepted the slice of apple pie. Dumbledore could only smile and leave the matter alone and talk with the barkeeper into getting a couple of rooms for the night. He succeeded, and Nick returned the plate and fork to the barkeeper after using a cleaning spell on them. "It was a good pie," he complimented in French as they walked up the stairs to their rooms. The rooms were not 5-star quality or anything, but were clean and quiet thanks to the silencing charms on them. Nick let Dusk and Nazgul out of the realm, where they immediately looked over the room in judgment. "None of that, you two, we are guest here, so be respectful," Nick chided the two beasts sternly. Nazgul merely snorted before hopping onto the bed and laying down, while Dusk looked away and perched on the windowsill instead while looking out the window. Nick shook his head at this before moving Nazgul over so he could go to bed. He had no trouble drifting off to sleep at all and slept soundly through the night. He woke up at about 7 in the morning and stretched with a yawn. There was a slight difference in time between the Isle and France, so he hadn't actually slept in at all. Dusk and Nazgul were less than pleased when he put them back inside the realm before he left the room and walked down the stairs to the pub below that was somehow just as busy as the night before. "As much good food you can give me for this," Nick said in French, putting 30 galleons on the counter as he sat down. The barkeeper counted it out with a confused look before Dumbledore's voice sounded out from nearby. "He really does have that large of an appetite," he said, and the barkeeper looked doubtful but chose to take the money anyways. Nick got a whole assortment of fruit, bread, pastries, and a small amount of bacon for his money, which while lacking in proteins was fine by him. The entire bar watched in amazement as Nick rapidly devoured the spread down to the last crumb. "Where does a small thing like you even put that amount of food?" The barkeeper couldn't help but ask curiously. Nick merely rolled up his sleeve to show his lean defined arm muscles. I am no slouch, he stated with a smirk. Chapter 324, Villas. So it is. If I'd have known you were fueling a body like that, I'd have given you more meat, the barkeeper said with a laugh. You two here for the pageant, I take it? The man asked while polishing a mug with a cloth. How'd you guess? Nick asked in surprise, since as far as he knew neither of them had mentioned it before now. Dumbledore's been sent an invitation to participate for years now on account of the phoenix that keeps him company. Madame Maxim has had her eye on getting a dress inspired by it for quite some time now. Can't blame her, it's a majestic creature without a doubt, the man explained with a smile. I figured he finally decided to indulge her on account of a juicy bit of information I heard from one of my ministry regulars in the games department, he added, but Dumbledore stopped him from saying more. There's no guarantee that we'll even go through, so no need to get his hopes up, the headmaster said sternly, so the barkeeper dropped the topic. Nick already had an idea of what was being talked about and wasn't surprised to hear it. Despite how it seemed in the book, there was no way in hell that a massive international event like the Triwizard Tournament was set up in the space of a few months that happened between the third and fourth year. Rather than think that Voldemort, who didn't have any followers other than Peter and Barty Crouch Jr. at the time, could set up such a thing, it was more probable he simply used it to his benefit. Even now Nick could understand why Dumbledore would be trying to hold such an event, what with Grindelwald causing chaos and Voldemort returning. With all the bad stuff going on, what better a way to boost morale than to show the 3 Western Academies of Magic competing in a friendly, definitely not, manner? Still, Nick didn't say anything to show that he actually knew what was being talked about, and merely waited for the old man to finish his own breakfast. After that they left the hostel and went back to the ministry to take the Fleur de Beaux Batons, since apparition directly there was forbidden. They weren't the only ones either, as a few dozen people with cages of various sizes were also waiting for the chance to fly over. Nick found it fairly clear that most of these people were only here just because they felt like it, with some of the creatures he saw in the cages. Horned toads, man-eating slugs, and a boggart that seemed to be having an identity crisis with the amount of forms it was shifting between. None of these had any beauty to them at all unless you had something wrong with your mind. The real competitors though had their cages covered with cloth or stored in spatial equipment. There was also quite a few people that were merely designers or spectators, that included a certain influential French pure-blood family. The women of that family were gawking at Nick quite openly, much to the confusion of the men. Nick smirked and tipped his head slightly in acknowledgement before ignoring them, as he was studying the magical items on each person nearby. He may not be able to see the runes directly, but he could still figure out what the items did and as a result attempt to mimic them later. It might not be plagiarism exactly, but he was definitely towing that line. The only reason he was even doing this was so he could pass the information on to Hermione and Daphne as a Christmas present. Still, despite his choosing to ignore the Delacour family, it didn't mean they did the same, or rather could do the same. His mere presence seemed to suppress them to an uncomfortable degree, like what a peasant might feel when presented before a powerful king. The worst part is that they had no idea why this was, and that made it hard for them to do anything besides stare at Nick. Do either of you know what is going on with them? One of the older men in a suit asked worriedly. Are they Vila? Nick asked, slightly irritated at being interrupted from his magic memorizing. The man looked shocked. They are part Vila, how'd you know? He asked seriously. I have a passive bloodline trait that makes me hold dominion over all avian creatures, and as Vilas are part of that category, I imagine it's much like standing in the presence of your race's ruler. Before you ask, there is nothing I can do about it, so they will simply need to adapt to my presence, Nick explained honestly before going back to what he was doing. He didn't even feel like pointing out that as an all-female race there was no such thing as part Vila. You either were or were not a Vila, there is no in-between. Chapter 325, Irritating Situation. The older man looked surprised at the answer for a moment before accepting it easily, as it not only explained what was happening but was entirely possible with the vast potential of magic. I do apologize for his rude manner of speaking, Mr. Delacour, you simply caught him while he was scoping out his competition. Dumbledore said with a chuckle. Is he competing in the pageant? The older man asked, surprised since he had assumed it was Dumbledore that was participating. Indeed he is. I dare say he has a strong chance of winning as well. The old goat said in a friendly manner. As much as I would love to chat about this, I should probably go and calm down my family before they do something drastic. The older Delacour man said before walking back to his family and explaining the situation. The Delacour family was a small but influential family that had their hands in quite a few French pies as one of the oldest pure-blood families in France. At the moment it consisted of the grandparents, with the grandmother being considered half Vila by the wider world. The parents under that consisted of a single daughter and the son-in-law that were around the Weasley parents' age. And finally under that was the two daughters, with one being 15 and the other being 10. The eldest daughter was currently missing from the family here since she was a student at Beauxbatons and the school's holiday break was the same as Hogwarts and thus hadn't started yet. Only the family members themselves, as well as those familiar with Velas, knew that the women of the family weren't in fact human at all but true Vela, hiding behind the lie to retain the privileges of wizards in the form of magical education and wand use. It was an international law that no magical race was permitted to own a wand under any circumstance, and so this lie was fiercely defended by the family. This made Nick's presence troubling to them, to say the least, as the women wanted nothing more than to kneel in front of him instinctually. They resisted the urge, of course, but it didn't make the situation any better for them at all. Sadly, they couldn't exactly chase him off without proper reason, as he was not doing anything wrong at all. The only method left to them was the most irritating one: grin and bear with it. The little girl of the family was the most uncomfortable, as she was having the hardest time out of them all controlling her impulses. Nick meanwhile was growing more and more irritated as time passed while they waited in line, as the magic of the Velas was going out of control and constantly trying to affect his mind to pay attention to them. A Vela's allure was a sort of compulsion magic that drew male attention to its owner, and despite being the magical equivalent of a king to avian creatures, Nick was still very much male. This meant the allure was battering against Sanner and his occlumency shields constantly, like an alarm clock going off no matter how many times he hits off. As a result, he was starting to lose his patience, which Dumbledore was the first to notice from the barely contained magical energy he sensed. Realizing that Nick was getting close to exploding in anger, Dumbledore quickly cast an isolation spell on him that cut off the allure affecting him. While this also cut Nick off from copying the magical effects of the wizard and witch's magical items, it still let him calm down. Having the allure cut off, however, made the Delacour women flinch slightly, as the magic was intrinsically part of themselves and thus it stung to get it cut like that. The family didn't say anything, however, as it was fairly clear from the expression on Nick's face that they were irritating him with it. Thankfully, Dumbledore didn't need to maintain the isolation charm for much longer, as it was finally their turn to use the flu. Nick got hit with the allure for a brief moment again before they vanished from the ministry, but he ignored it. I'll need to create something to keep that magic away from me if I want to get through the next 3 days without incident. Nick thought seriously as they finally stepped out of the fireplace and into Beauxbatons proper. He knew that the school was very big on style and beauty, but what he was met with was frankly speaking insane. The whole room they were in is covered in woven baby blue silk and gold tapestries, while the carpet was and stone was magical beast fur and marble with actual veins of gold running through it. Chapter 326, Olympe Maxime. This room was clearly a reception area, though, as there was no chairs or other furniture anywhere in it. There was a pair of double doors made of white oak that remained open and had 2 people waiting next to them. An extremely tall woman in a flowing black dress that had a collar of white fur. She had short, well-maintained brown hair and dark eyes, while her face bore a sort of warm, soft curvature to it that hid her age well. Nick knew who this woman was even without introduction, that to his knowledge from the books, Olympe Maxime, the headmistress of Beauxbatons. She smiled widely when she saw Dumbledore and walked over until she towered over both of them. "What a pleasant surprise vous have," she said happily with a thick accent while holding out her hand, which Dumbledore kissed politely on the knuckles. "It is always wonderful to see you, Olympe, though I must admit that I am not here to compete but rather my student is instead," Dumbledore said with a smile. The large woman seemed taken back by this and finally turned her attention to Nick to get a good look at him. Such a handsome young man. What marvelous air and eyes, golden-like. She froze mid-speech when the recognition of what his eyes were like sank in. Like those of a phoenix, yes, and not without reason either. Nicholas here is quite loved by birds. Dumbledore said with a smile. Nicholas Ravenclaw, ring-maker. Nick introduced himself in French with a slight respectful bow. Olympe Maxime, headmistress of Beauxbatons, and happy to make your acquaintance. She said warmly in French once he made it clear he spoke the language. Dumbledore clapped softly. Now that introduction are finished, perhaps we had best move elsewhere lest we hold up the other visitors. He said warmly. Azez, Celeste can handle this, I am confident. The large woman said, and the middle-aged looking French women still at the doors nodded. Of course, madam, please enjoy your conversation. She said in French. The headmistress then led Nick and Dumbledore away into the school grounds outside the reception room. Rather than having the floors set up in the school itself, it was instead in a separate building just outside the school's protective wards. It was a smart placement as it meant the school couldn't be invaded via the floor network. Beauxbatons school grounds were much like those of Hogwarts, extremely spacious and filled with a picturesque scenery. The castle itself was old and richly designed with solid architecture, though the material composition seemed a bit gaudy in Nick's opinion as white stone clashed hard with the otherwise green area. Much to his discomfort, though, the majority of the grounds was covered by a very well-kept and vibrant floral garden. Nick may as well be a dwarf with how the only way he was truly comfortable was being surrounded by stone walls and metal tools. The half-giant noticed his discomfort immediately. Is it not to your liking? She asked, worried that there may be something off with the garden. Nick shook his head. It's truly wonderful, but sadly I am personally more comfortable with stone and metal surrounding me. It's a crafter's curse, I'm afraid. Nick explained apologetically. Ah. I understand. Did you know Nicholas Flamel himself has a similar problem? He is most comfortable when he has at least some sort of magical item with him. She said with a kind smile. Obviously this conversation was happening in French, and despite speaking the language himself, Dumbledore was perfectly content merely listening. Nick smirked. I imagine the man must have all sorts of bad habits after being alive for 600 years. He joked, and she laughed. Oh yes, by far the worst has to be the way he drinks his coffee, black as night. He says he enjoys the bitterness of the drink, but I simply can't fathom why. She complains. I prefer coffee with a bit of pure chocolate and almond cream, gives it a lovely sweetness and nutty aftertaste. Nick said, and her eyes lit up. That does sound like a wonderful treat. She said with a smile. They continued chatting peacefully for a few moments as they walked through the gardens, and it became abundantly clear to Nick that she loved to talk. She didn't drone on or anything like that, but she clearly enjoyed holding a conversation about any topic she found interesting, gossip especially. Nick was more than happy to indulge her in that manner, as she was a font of interesting information once she got going. Sadly, all good thing must come to an end, and he felt the allure of Vila's tapping at his protections once again. Chapter 327, Sour Meeting. This time the allure was much weaker than in the ministry, which made sense considering unlike then it is coming from a single person. Nick scowled as he turned to look at the source of the allure in the form of a blonde girl that was staring at him in confusion and anger. Remove your magic, he commanded, having had enough of dealing with this allure. The girl stumbled as she instinctively did as he commanded, suffering from the backlash of it. Vilas were able to suppress their allure to a degree but never fully retract it normally, so it was foreign and painful for her when she did. Fleur, are you all right? Madame Maxime asked, concerned after seeing this happen. Fleur grit her teeth and glared at Nick. What are you doing to me? She hissed angrily. Nick scoffed. I hold dominion over all avian creatures and you are Vila. You exist under me in terms of hierarchy, so you feel suppressed naturally. He said calmly. That's impossible. I am no servant girl. She said defiantly. Nick shook his head at that. Though it is not a matter of consent, all avian races are subserviently to me, and Vilas are no different. he said honestly. Fleur looked hateful. That is unfair. Who gets to decide that? She exclaimed angrily. What are you talking about? Explain what is going on. Maxime demanded, unable to understand the situation. Dumbledore sighed but explained Nick's unique nature in terms of avian creatures and how it creates a feeling of subservience to him which Fleur was likely rejecting due to pride. Perhaps it's best if you avoid him whilst he's here, my dear. The headmistress said to try and help the situation. This was a very awkward situation for everyone involved as neither side wanted to deal with the other because of factors out of both their controls. For Nick it was the irritation that the allure caused, while for Fleur it was because of her nature clashing with her personality. She was a proud and powerful person and refused to bow her head to anyone, which clashed with her Vila instincts to do exactly that. Even worse was that she couldn't release her allure while in Nick's presence since he had commanded her to remove it, causing her a lot of pain. She could only huff and leave in anger to escape the discomfort she was feeling. I apologize for this situation. Had I any idea it would happen I would have never brought him to compete in the pageant. Dumbledore said honestly with a deep bow. The half-giant shook her head with a sigh. You could not have known. She said in her heavily accented English. As for you, I hope you can forgive Fleur for her disrespect. This must have taken her by great surprise and angered her. She is quite prideful, so your ability must bother her greatly. Maxime said to Nick in French. He waved it off. It's not like I will need to deal with her much in the future, so it doesn't matter to me how she thinks of me. He said honestly. She accepted that answer without any issue since it was perfectly logical. That reminds me, however, you never did say what you were using to compete, did you? She changed the topic to one that she was interested in easily at that point. I actually have two possible entries in the form of my familiar, Nazgul, and one of my companions, Dusk. Nick said with a smirk as he released both of them from his realm. The shift from lifeless and barren that was the realm to filled with life and color disoriented the two beasts. Madame Maxime, however, had her jaw drop in shock at what she saw. The first was an immortal bird native to Asia, while the other was an unknown creature that was very beautiful. Dusk here is my companion and won't allow anyone to touch him. Nazgul on the other hand is my familiar and the first and only one of her kind, a ring beast. She will let you touch her as she is quite friendly usually. Nick introduced the two creatures with a laugh. Dusk looked at the huge woman sternly after landing on Nick's shoulder, since he could tell that she was half-giant like Hagrid. The gamekeeper had been quite insistent on trying to pet him despite getting bit more than once, which made the bird wary of large folk like him. Madame Maxime was not a simple-minded person like Hagrid, so when she got warned about not touching the bird she knew better than to try and do so. Nazgul on the other hand was showered with affection that the spoiled creature accepted eagerly. Chapter 328, Pageant Start. Dumbledore and Nick were given a couple of rooms that the school reserved for important guests after that, while Nick was given access to the library after he asked. This first day was merely apportioned for guests to arrive while the contest field was set up. As a result, Nick vanished into the library eagerly for the entire day, while Dumbledore spent the day chatting with Newt's commander, who had shown up. The Magi-zoologist was beyond excited to examine both Dusk and Nazgul while he was there, since the two creatures were allowed to roam freely by Madame Maxime. It was a rather entertaining scene to see the old researcher looking like an overexcited child as he looked over Nazgul. She absolutely loved the attention and was more than happy to let him pet her all over as he felt out her musculature and bone structure. Dusk meanwhile was straight murderous, looking for anyone that got curious about Nick in the library and tried to approach him. Unlike the library at Hogwarts, not only were the topics in Beauxbatons library not restrictive in terms of topics, but it was also very well organized. The books were categorized and sorted by topic, alphabetical order, difficulty, and even language. This made it easy for Nick to find a book on any topic he wanted to, which saved him a lot of time. Unfortunately, much like at Hogwarts, there was very few books on topics that interested him and weren't common. Nick had gotten so engrossed in reading that he didn't even notice when it was time for dinner and completely missed out on eating. He may have even missed sleep entirely had it not been for Dumbledore coming to figure out what was going on with him. Nick couldn't really be blamed for his zeal in this matter, as he had a mere 3 days to cram as much information as possible from this library into his head. In that time he even needed to compete against others with Nazgul and Dusk, who was also allowed to participate by Madame Maxime as an exception to the one per person rule. She didn't fail to make it clear that she mostly just wanted to see what fabulous clothes the two of them could inspire. Still, Nick reluctantly went to bed while abandoning his furious consumption of books, for now. The next day he woke up bright and early and made nearly every student in the school and most of the adults too drop their jaws. He went to breakfast and ate enough food to easily fill a horse all without making even a little bit of a mess. It was the strangest sight for them as he shoveled down food all while maintaining perfect manners. The only person in the entire room that ate as much as he did was the headmistress, that was a half-giant and required way more calories than a normal person. When asked about it by her, Nick had no hesitation at all, transfiguring away his robe into shorts to reveal his well-developed physique before undoing the transfiguration. The entire school was left in a state of shock at that sight, as he was about as fit as possible for someone his age. No one doubted that his body likely required that much nutrition at that point, but was more interested in exactly how he gained a body like that. The older girls in the school were instead mostly fantasizing about what he would look like after a few more years, while the boys wanted to know what magic he used. Things got interesting, however, when the competition finally began and each competitor set up a viewing stand for the magical creatures they brought. The first part of the competition was the appearance portion, in which cases the judges and spectators walked around the area and looked over the beasts. The regular participants for this annual event knew that there was actually a hidden judging part that secretly raised or lowered the judges' scores. This was the tameness level of the creatures in question that had specific people secretly antagonize the creatures to test their attitudes. The antagonizers for Dusk and Nazgul, however, didn't know whether to laugh or cry, as the beasts were so arrogant that they ignored them no matter what they said. Cursing, nitpicking, berating, absolutely nothing fazed the creatures at all. To be fair though, the antagonizers weren't allowed to physically touch the creatures of the competition, or else they would have quickly learned that Dusk was not nearly as tame as he appeared. Still, the big bird quickly grew tired of entertaining these people by even looking at them and went to sleep on Nick's shoulder. Chapter 329, Secret Alchemist. Nick was also fairly bored, since all he had to do for the pageant was sit in place while the two beasts soaked up the attention. With that in mind, he had broke out his quill and a blank book that he started to write down his take on all the magical items he memorized yesterday. He of course labeled each individual item neatly, but the book quickly started to get covered in runes on both the front and backs of the pages. He frowned a bit after he finished the book, since he still had quite a few more enchantments to write down. He could only shrug and take out another blank book and continue after labeling the title as Part 2. He didn't notice it at first, since there was a bunch of different magical signatures around him, but one had stopped at his stand. It was a middle-aged looking man with short brown hair and curious blue eyes that picked up the first book Nick had set down and was looking through it with interest. A little crude, but all these enchantments would certainly work, the man said with a smile as he put the book down. Nick looked up from the second book at this time and immediately paled at what his magical senses were telling him. This person was old, like really old, and powerful to boot. This person's magical energy was between Dumbledore and Slytherin, with a heavy inclination towards the latter's power level. Nicholas Flamel, I take it? Nick quickly recovered and asked politely. The man was taken back by this question for a moment before laughing and nodding his head with a look of understanding. You have magical sight, or is it hearing? No need to answer, I prefer to figure it out myself. Those are the only way you could have seen through my disguise after all. If it's not too troublesome, can you tell me what specifically gave me away? The man spoke calmly and with a burning curiosity. Nick smiled bitterly. I hadn't expected that one of my secrets would be seen through just from exposing you. It was both your age as well as your mana level that exceeded even that of Dumbledore that gave you away, he said honestly, since there was no point in lying. The man before him was an ancient wizard with all the knowledge that may come from such a long lifespan, because unlike most wizards he loved research and learning new things. Few could understand the implications behind that, but Nick was very much aware of what it meant. It means that despite having less mana than Slytherin, he had so much more knowledge and skill that he could very likely toss the founder around without much effort. Nicholas Flamel was a magical juggernaut and everyone knew it. That was why no one dared to try and directly steal from the man or attack him. Ah yes, that would certainly do it. I hadn't expected to meet someone with your rare gift and neglected to hide those. While I can't remove my disguise for understandable reasons, I suppose introductions are in order. Nicholas Flamel, alchemist. Flamel said with a slight bow. Nicholas Ravenclaw, ringmaker. Nick said, returning the bow. I have been rather curious about you for quite some time, little fellow. You can then of course imagine my delight to find you visiting my alma mater with my student and friend. Flamel said while wandlessly conjuring a chair to sit in. You said my rune sentences were crude, why? Nick asked while pointing at the book. Not crude as in incorrect, as each rune and even the sentence structure is flawless, however you wrote them like you were talking or holding a conversation. Runes were never meant to be used in that manner, they were designed to cause complex things with simply concepts. Take wands for example, you only need 3 or 4 runes to create a working wand, but adding more rarely makes the finished product better. Complex enchantments like this need merely a handful of carefully chosen words alongside the correct will while engraving them to function. The old alchemist said, and Nick understood what he meant. So I've been looking at runes wrong this entire time then? He said with a disappointed sigh. No child, not wrong but skewed instead. It was like you were looking at the subject with only a single eye. The image you received was not wrong but incomplete, off if you would. What is most impressive is that you clearly didn't learn runes in a traditional manner, as this is a simple and basic thing taught in the class. The old alchemist said with a smile. Chapter 330, Secret Alchemist, 2. Now that's a face I haven't seen in many years. Dumbledore said with nostalgia as he walked up. I can only think of a single person who may take on that visage whilst in my presence. It is good to see you, Nico. He spoke warmly. Albus, I was just helping this child understand a flaw in his understanding of runes. It is quite impressive what he has achieved without proper guidance in this matter, you know. Flamel said with a wide smile. Dumbledore chuckled. Always the teacher, old friend? He asked jokingly. Flamel shrugged. I always find that it helps to refresh my knowledge by teaching others. To be fair though, there is clearly not much that this young man needs to learn on the topic, as he clearly has a firm grasp of the language. See for yourself. Flamel said while pointing at the book on the table. Dumbledore picked it up and skimmed through it with a surprised look. If the basics weren't clearly skewed, I would almost think that you wrote this, Nico. It is a very good compendium of enchantments beyond the unnecessary complexity. He said honestly with a sigh. My thoughts exactly. Flamel said in happy agreement. Might I ask why you are writing this, as I doubt you have much need for such a thing with your enchantment method? Dumbledore asked curiously while setting the book on the table. I was going to create a copy of it before giving it to my 2 friends that are studying runes as a Christmas gift. Nick explained, since he had no reason to lie. According to Phileas, that is Miss Granger and Miss Greengrass, correct? The old goat confirmed, and Nick nodded. After a revision into the proper rune format, I believe it would be a fine book for learning from. I do hope I can convince you to add a copy to the library as well. Dumbledore said honestly. I'm flattered, but it's not something that deserves to be added to a school library like the one at Hogwarts. None of the enchantments even have a description of what they do. Nick said honestly. While I can agree that it would be a poor choice for an amateur's to pick up, but for an inexperienced but knowledgeable individual it is an excellent teaching text, as it contains every level of enchantment from simple to complex. Flamel disagreed with Nick. Rather than arguing with someone who clearly knew better than him, Nick said that he would consider the matter. Flamel stayed to chat for about an hour before leaving, with a promise to visit at a later date when things weren't so busy. The day's portion of the pageant ended shortly after that, with a score assigned to each magical beast that had been present. The judges were quite professional, as they even scored the obvious joke creatures that Nick had seen previously. While both Dusk and Nazgul had a similar score, Nazgul won out slightly thanks to her friendly demeanor compared to Dusk's angry mean one. The next day's pageant part was basically a catwalk where the bests got to show off their abilities and move around so everyone could see all of them. There was extra points if the beast was dangerous but under control. Nick found that part rather funny as Nazgul could directly attack and consume souls while Dusk was a powerful immortal bird. In the Ministry's classification, Dusk was an XXXXX class dangerous creature and Nazgul had no classification for now, so the danger was definitely present. Still, that was a matter for tomorrow as far as Nick was concerned, while the library was a matter for today. He was more than eager to dive back into the treasure trove of knowledge set before him. He was not surprised at all to see several tomes written by Nicholas Flamel himself on various topics, considering the man had a particular fondness for the school as a graduate. Despite this, Nick made sure that the only topics he read books on while he was here as those that were rare and little known. For example, he found tomes on flight magic, veritology, rituals, spatial magic and even alchemy that were hard to find normally. The books on flight magic helped him greatly with his understanding of the topic despite once again not having any complete magics on it. The veritology books were mostly on more exotic materials and how wands used to be made before the industry standardized the procedure. The rituals mostly covered the same kinds as the books in Hogwarts, so he only schemed them. Spatial magic, though, was a stupidly complex matter that gave Nick a headache as he copied the two books he found. Chapter 331, Alchemical Knowledge. Alchemy was far more abundant in terms of books thanks to Nicholas Flamel's favoritism, but was a confusing subject to say the least. There was actually a few schools of thought involved in the subject that all alchemy fell under. The first was transmutation, or the changing of one thing into another permanently. This was accomplished in a few different ways, but the final result always requires the alchemist to exchange something of equal worth for the change. Usually this is in the form of mana, but it was possible to substitute other things. The second school of thought was the displacement school that sought to give magical abilities to an object that the object normally wouldn't have. Things got weird at this point, as you could in theory give even a simple pebble the ability to kill a god if you were able to trade the price required for it. Alchemy worked based on the principle of equivalent exchange after all, however, so the price of such a thing was horribly high. This school of alchemy, though, had heavy use of ritual circles and heavy material costs that changed in a way that left the alchemist needing to set up the magic from scratch every single time. The second to last school of alchemy was the life school, and was where things got very messy and dark very fast. The ultimate goal of this school was to create the supreme creature that was perfect in every way. Almost every alchemist in this school was a vile dark wizard or witch, as the easiest way to conduct experiments in this school was on living or unborn creatures by fusing external pieces onto them or altering them before birth. This was how an extremely large amount of monstrous magical creatures came about, and as such was almost outright banned globally. Nick copied the information on the subject but knew he was very unlikely to ever use it. The final school of alchemy was the emotion or soul school, and focused on giving emotions or true souls to their creations. This school was the most esoteric of all the schools, as it was so difficult to progress in that not even Nicholas Flamel wrote much on it beyond the barest hint of the starting point. This starting point was creating enchantments via one's own emotions to fulfill a need, which was extremely powerful magic considering the protection granted to Harry from his mother fell into this school. It was thanks to all this information on alchemy that Nick could roughly figure out how Nicholas Flamel managed to create the Philosopher's Stone. See, the great alchemist was born just before the Black Plague ran rampant across Europe, and while he may not have created the disease, he probably used the life force and deaths of the victims to create the stone, as that would be the only way it could allow it to do what it does. It explained why no one else had managed to create a stone in this long period of time since that point. Flamel had likely marked the disease so that each of its victims fueled his alchemical construct at the moment of their deaths. As more and more lives were lost, the stone gained greater and greater power until the disease finally was stomped out. By that point, though, the stone had the sacrificed power of between 50 to 75 million people killed by the disease. So much power was still not enough to give immortality via life extension, but it certainly gave a very large increase of maybe a few thousand years. It was likely what the elixir of life actually was pure life force distilled into liquid form that likely removed the effects of aging or injury on the body. Nick didn't think any lower of the great alchemist despite figuring it out as what he did, while certainly not righteous, was also not evil, merely opportunistic. More than likely the way Flamel saw it was that since these people were going to die either way, he might as well use them for his own benefit. While a callous way of looking at it to modern folk, it should be pointed out that this was also a time when Muggles actively hunted magical folk down. It was already good enough that Flamel hadn't made the disease way worse to squeeze out some extra profit. Still, it was getting late and Nick knew he was going to participate in the final stint of the pageant the next day and finished copying the information down before heading for the dining hall. He didn't need to worry about feeding Dusk or Nazgul. Chapter 332, Chat with Newt. Nick got gawked at while he ate again, but he ignored that in favor of indulging his hunger. After that he turned in for the night, content with his gains while he was here. He woke up nice and early the next day and tidied up the room he was in, since he wouldn't be returning to it at the end of the day. He walked through the halls of Beauxbatons while admiring the details of the castle. Hogwarts was grand and all, but in terms of details it was fairly lacking, since the focus was mostly on pragmatism. Beauxbatons, on the other hand, clearly placed heavily emphasis on beauty and art, as the halls were adorned with any statues, paintings, and expensive but pretty materials like gold-veined marble. This wasn't to say that the wards protecting the school weren't extremely powerful, merely that the look of the place was different. There weren't many people up at this time, so Nick went fairly unnoticed as he strolled through the hallways. The few people who did notice him wisely decided that they wanted nothing to do with the large, unreasonably angry-looking bird on his shoulder. Nick had long given up on improving Dusk's attitude and mostly ignored the fear he caused as a result. So long as no one tried to touch the bird, he was actually fairly harmless, as he didn't go picking fights for no reason. He was far too arrogant for such a thing after all. As it turned out, however, Newt's commander was also an early riser and unlike everyone else knew that he had nothing to fear from the bird. "Ah, Mr. Ravenclaw, just the person I was hoping to bump into," the older man said warmly as he spotted Nick in the hallway. "Can't imagine you'd have much reason to see me besides my familiar or Dusk here," Nick said, slightly confused. He honestly had no reason that he could think of as to why the Magi-zoologist would want to see him other than the beast he kept in his company. He had already passed all the information he had on the celestial bird the last time they spoke, so it couldn't be that. "I actually had an offer for you, in fact, that I thought might interest you given your unique situation. You see, I happen to be visiting an old friend in the form of a Thunderbird over the summer and was wondering if you might be interested in meeting him," Newt asked with a smile. Nick was taken back by this question, as he hadn't even thought about it despite knowing that Newt once had a Thunderbird in his possession. "I wouldn't mind meeting such a creature myself, but I doubt I'll have the time, unfortunately. I am under a rather heavy time crunch to improve my abilities and simply can't relax for any real period of time," Nick said with an apologetic sigh. Newt was surprised and furrowed his brows. "What could be so important as to have a child like yourself under so much pressure?" he asked, concerned. "I may have offended Voldemort quite heavily, and he also may have recently been resurrected," Nick said casually. Newt's jaw practically hit the floor at this, which was to be expected considering the nature of the information. Surely Dumbledore would not allow a child to be dragged into a matter like this and would protect you? Newt questioned in disbelief. "In a normal situation that would be true, unfortunately the situation is far from normal." Nick then explained the pressure the old goat was under, as well as his own exemption from classes and the reasons for it. Basically it boiled down to the old man being far too busy to help Nick actively, so he was basically given free reins to improve and protect himself to the best of his ability. Newt could only sigh in resignation that Nick truly was under a serious time crunch and indeed had no time for a relaxing trip to the States to see a Thunderbird. With that matter truly settled, Newt could only change the topic to Nazgul to raise his mood. It was a rather interesting conversation for Nick, as the Magi-zoologist knew his field well and pointed out a few of the strange features she had. Things like the clear serpentine neck and head that resembled a basilisk suspiciously closely, to even how she had features from both phoenixes as well as thunderbirds. The thing that seemed to confuse Newt the most about her, however, was the ring at the end of her tail that seemed to serve no actual purpose beyond appearances. Nick had to explain how Nazgul was born for Newt to understand why that existed, but that information only gave the man even more questions. Chapter 333, Pageant Results. Newt bombarded Nick with various strange questions for the next 30 minutes until it was finally time for breakfast, at which point he reluctantly left. While Nick didn't mind sharing what he knew of Nazgul with the man, he had trouble keeping up with some of the questions. For example, Newt asked how many feathers she had as if it was a totally normal thing to sit down and count them. Sure, Nick understood that the man was being thorough, but this was plain weird. Breakfast went much like the previous 2 meals, with Nick eating a large sum of food before leaving for the pageant area. The area had been changed from the sort of fairish-like setup to a wide open field with various objects and walkways throughout it. Nick merely needed to look over each of the objects to figure out what they were used for. They were certainly thorough with the tests they set up, he thought, impressed. It was very comprehensive, as there was 7 different types of strength testers, speed testers, magical ability testers, and various miscellaneous other tools for testing unique aspects. All in all, the competition was about as fair as possible at this stage for judging the best beast. Nick took his time explaining how each of the pieces of equipment worked to Nazgul and Dusk, as well as which ones they would be using. There wasn't a piece of equipment for testing soul-based attacks, but that was fine for Nick since he didn't want to publicize that ability of Nazgul's. The shows of power that Dusk was going to do was its firepower, strength, speed, and aerial prowess. For Nazgul it was a bit more complex, as she had far more abilities than any of the immortal birds, as she had teleportation, super strength, special fire, regular fire, soul attacking and devouring, flight, basilisk eyes, and high intelligence. She may also even have the rebirth ability of the immortal birds, or perhaps might just be inherently immortal. Nick had to admit that his familiar was nearly as crazy to quantify as himself in terms of abilities, and almost certainly many times more powerful. Nazgul was strange in that regard, as she actually had no more magical power than a wizarding owl, yet was a spiritual juggernaut in terms of spiritual energy. To explain it would be like comparing Slytherin's mana to Ron's. It was incomparable larger and more potent. This led to a rather funny loophole in the amount of power a creature could have on Earth at the moment due to the low mana levels. As Nazgul's main source of power wasn't mana, she was not really limited in how powerful she could get, and as a result was likely the most powerful thing on the planet in an unsealed state. Thankfully she was very gentle and lazy most of the time, so was no real threat unless somehow pissed off, which hadn't happened yet. All of the participants for the pageant were given a badge with a number on it to show them when they could come out onto the field and show off their beast's abilities. Nick was the only participant given 2 badges due to having 2 different beasts competing in the pageant. For Dusk he had the number 34, and for Nazgul the number 104, which was towards the end of the pageant. It was at this time that the participants got to finally see who the judges were, since they were hidden in the previous part. Madame Maxime, Dumbledore, Martin Dumont, Apollon Delacour, and Newt's commander made up the judges and were sitting comfortably at a table chatting. Nick could feel his eyebrow twitch at the lineup, as at least 3 of the 5 judges were people he has interacted with to a slightly personal degree in some manner. Dumbledore is in almost constant contact with him. Newt was in love with magical creatures and thus eagerly chatted and felt comfortable around Nick, and Apollon Delacour was a Vila and thus subject to his avian dominion. The only true neutral judges were Madame Maxime and Martin Dumont. Martin Dumont was an interesting individual to have as a judge in this competition, considering his expertise was in dueling. In fact, during the height of Voldemort's reign years back, the man was the 3-time champion of the global dueling tournament. The best part though was that the man had a raging hatred for the Death Eaters under Voldemort after they stole his infant child to use as blackmail, but ended up killing it. There was no evidence found, but the 3 Death Eaters responsible went missing a year after that incident, and all fingers pointed at this man. Chapter 334, Pageant Results, 2. The man was a well-known gruff and impatient individual, so it came as quite the surprise that he was judging a pageant of all things. Nick could understand roughly how this judge's table had been created and found it most probable that it was mostly Madame Maxime's doing. She likely used her authority as the headmistress of the school hosting this event to get Dumbledore on the table, and the rest were either well known for magical beasts or were friends of hers. Nick decided to ignore this though, since the competition itself didn't interest him all that much. Anyway, this event turns out he will have accomplished his goal of publicizing Nazgul to the world. Winning was merely a bonus at this point in time, so he was not bothered by any part of the pageant anymore. Each numbered badge was called in order, and the participants each took to the field with their beast to strut their stuff. The only interesting creature before dusk belonged to the 12th numbered badge and came in the form of a horned water snake that arrogantly showed off in the field. The species was well known for their foresight ability that made them very hard to find, as they saw you coming before you ever got near them. The species as a whole was dark blue and about as thick as a bucket and nearly 20 feet long on average. They got their name from the bodies of water they made their homes along with the long curved horn on their heads. To even see one was rare, but the owner of this particular member of the species, that was a woman with her face covered, clearly had it as her familiar from how close she appeared with it. What left Nick surprised, however, was that the woman spoke in Parcel tongue to the serpent. This was also a point of interest for everyone else, as well as the gift was very rare, with only India having a fairly large population of users for it. Unlike in Europe, Parcel tongue was a revered ability to have in India and was mostly used by healers and sages. I wonder if she naturally has the ability or if she got it from her familiar. Nick wondered curiously. That is how familiar bonds normally worked after all, as the familiar passing some abilities to their partner and vice versa. Nick and Nazgul were unique in that most of her abilities came from him and he got almost nothing from her, since he was both her creator and partner. Nick knew he had received something from her through their bond, but other than a slight increase in spiritual power, he had no idea what. He tried the whole basilisk eyes thing, but that was a dud, and even the whole soul-eating thing wasn't it either. He also couldn't turn into lightning to teleport. He tried really hard on that one. Besides the brief glance he received from the woman after Dusk's number was called, Nick did not interact with her at all, since he had no real reason to. Dusk didn't need Nick to tell him what to do once they were out on the field and began to show off his prowess. It probably didn't need to be stated, but Dusk going all out with his fire and strength was an awe-inspiring sight. The bird casually lifted quarter-ton weights and flew around with them for a minute before putting them down. After that it erupted in flame in the special fire-resistant area and bathed the whole field in scorching heat as he went all out. Immortal birds were not a joke when they wanted to show their power, as each one of them could cause considerable damage if they wished to. Thunderbirds could call a hurricane filled with copious amounts of lightning on a whim. Ho-Hos summoned fierce flames like those of the sun, and phoenixes could teleport via flame and had strong fire manipulation powers. Once Dusk's performance was complete, they left the field to quite a lot of applause. The woman with the horned water snake seemed to be sizing them up at that point, but Nick ignored it as she wasn't alone. Quite a few participants were doing the same, either out of fear, intrigue, and concern, but all eyes were on Nick and Dusk. The pageant went on after that, and Nazgul left more than a few jaws on the ground with her performance. It didn't come as much of a surprise that she ended winning by a landslide, as she ticked all the right boxes. Beauty, grace, power, temperament, and uniqueness, she had all of that in spades. Chapter 335, Return to Hogwarts. The prize for winning wasn't anything all that special for Nick, as it was merely a few hundred galleons and a spot in the global newspapers. The later of which interested him the most, as it fixed the issue he may have with taking Nazgul traveling. Dusk actually wasn't even in the top 5, since his temperament caused his final score to drop a lot. He was a very angry bird, and it showed in the way he acted at all times. Nick was pretty sure that Dumbledore had a hand in the sharpness of the hit his points took, though. Dusk didn't actually care about the matter and only participated since it helped Nick ingratiate himself with the headmistress. A well-earned success, Monsieur Ravenclaw. The little one is simply such a treat to have around that it pains me to see her leave. Alas, she is your familiar, and thus nothing I can say would tempt you to give her over to me. Madame Maxime says in French on the way back to the Fleur building to see Nick and Dumbledore off. I imagine you'll have the opportunity to see her at a later date. Nick said with a grin. I will hold you to that, young man. She said with a smile. As much as we have all enjoyed these last few days, it is time to depart for now. Please do take care of yourself, Olymp. The world is a dangerous place these days after all. Dumbledore said before he and Nick left for the Ministry, as they had to take yet another flight back to the British Isles. The Ministries didn't waste their time and had them sent over quickly, since Dumbledore was not the sort of person you tried to hold up with nonsense. Will you be staying at Hogwarts for the holidays? The old goat asked once they stepped out of the flue in his office. Nick nodded. I'll be busy in the next few weeks working out how to fix the broken magic in Professor Lupin, and will have little time for relaxation, he said seriously. Also do keep in mind that whatever I come up with simply won't be possible to mass produce, so for the rest of the werewolves it would be better to try and devise a animagi reversal ritual to strip the curse from them, he added before leaving the office. Dumbledore could only sigh after hearing that, as he wanted to get to work on exactly such a thing but simply lacked the time for it these days. Perhaps Minerva would help Remus with this, the old man pondered to himself. Nick meanwhile let both Dusk and Nazgul out of his realm, since they were back at Hogwarts and did not need to be confided anymore. He knew that while they weren't uncomfortable in the realm, that they hated how small it was. Nick had a plan to fix that here soon, but for now there was little he could do about it. Heading to the workshop, Nick was greeted to a strange sight along the way. Fred and George were walking around disguised as snowmen to prank anyone they could with it. Nick looked over the illusion spell they had used for this and nodding happily at what he found. It was clear to him that the twins had taken his disdain for the illusion they used at the time personally and improved their illusion magic skills. Say what you want about the twins, but they weren't stupid by any means and were actually very talented wizards that simply didn't like doing boring activities. To be fair, no one usually did, but most people sucked it up rather than ignore the punishments and do the bare minimum while focusing their energy on something else, like the twins. The teaching staff have made their disappointment in the twins' wasting of talent very clear. Nick didn't think they were wasting their talent at all, but rather focusing it on what they enjoyed instead, which was jokes. Calidum pedes, Nick said, and watched as the twins started jumping around like they were standing barefoot on a hot surface. The hot feet charm was actually harmless, but it made the victim think they were burning their soles so long as they had their feet on the ground. Ha 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 ha. Nick burst into laughter at the sight, as it was ironic to see a pair of snowmen with burning feet. The twins also laughed, since they knew they had had good. Nick removed the charm on them with a smirk. It looks like a little heat wasn't enough to melt these snowmen. Maybe I should use some fire this time, he pondered out loud before puffing out a small amount of azure flame from his nose with a wide grin. Chapter 336, Wolf Study. Wicked, the twins exclaimed at the same time when they saw the flames. How'd you do that without a spell, mate? One of the twins asked curiously. It's a secret, Nick said with a teasing smile. Well, that's no fun at all, they complained loudly. Nick chuckled. So what sort of mischief have you two been up to, Anything good? He asked with interest. They shook their heads. The usual japes and pranks on the unsuspecting, I'm afraid. Business has been a bit slow, what with the holidays coming up, you know how it is, one of them said, and Nick nodded in understanding. Christmas was usually a peaceful and joyous time in the Isles, so few people would have an interest in the high energy of mischief at this time. I'll let you two get back to it then, he said, and bid them farewell as he left. The workshop was empty when he got there, which he had already expected. Entering his realm, Nick started to analyze the samples he had taken from Lupin a few days ago. Until now they had been kept fresh via a stasis field, so he had no trouble at all spotting the difference between them. The hair samples were mostly unchanged from the transformation, which was to be expected considering the stuff was dead material to begin with. The blood and skin samples, on the other hand, showed drastic changes in both form and function. The skin, for example, had a very well hidden protective magical enchantment on each cell that was impossible to notice in the unchanged cells. This was clearly where the resistance to spells that werewolves had came from, but what made Nick irritated was that he could tell that this magic was added to the lycanthropy curse later due to the differing styles it had. An alchemist of the life school experimented on werewolves in the past, it seems. That complicates things a bit since I now need to make even more changes to the magic now. Nick thought, irritated. The blood samples though left him frustrated at the changes between the regular and transformed cells. The regular blood cells behaved normally and weren't of much note, while the transformed cells were completely different than the normal ones. They were more active, held much more oxygen and highly cancerous. No wonder werewolves don't usually live to old age, they suffer the damage of stage 4 cancer 3 nights a month. Even the strong vitality of the curse can only barely keep them stable, but the damage probably stacks up over time until their bodies collapse on themselves. How pitiful! Nick thought with a frown. Just looking over these samples told him what sort of horrible experience it must be to be stricken with the curse. Shorter life expectancy, agony once a month, social stigma, and the constant worry about infecting others. It was nightmarish to say the least, and Nick knew that he would want to fix this problem had he not needed all the time possible to improve himself and complete his missions. Once he was done with the biological samples, he moved on to the ring that recorded the life force of its wearer for a period of time. In this case it was before, during and after Lupin transformed, so he could actively see what changes occurred during this time. He started the playback of the ring while the realm analyzed it in detail from start to finish. Once it was done, the realm manifested an illusionary image of the entire recorded life force. It looked quite a bit like a bright red aurora floating in the air with various complex shapes and designs in it, much like runes, but not at the same time. Nick couldn't translate them since they weren't an actual language, but he didn't need to either. This data was used to see what changed during the process so that he could focus on figuring out those parts specifically. The lycanthropy curse was easily the most complex piece of magic he had ever seen, and as a result correcting its flaws was an equally if not harder task than just outright blocking the transformation. Normally he wouldn't waste his time and just create a ring to stop Lupin from transforming, but he needed a lot of data to successfully modify his own animagus ritual, and the information he was receiving would help him greatly. In addition, he really wanted that Daedra heart that the mission would give him if he fixed the lycanthropy curse. He even knew what the best possible use for the heart would be too, and it had him very eager. Chapter 337, Wolf Study, 2. Nick shook his head to rid himself of these thoughts as he commanded the realm to slowly play the recording while studying each and every spot on the image for even the smallest of changes. At first he thought that the curse somehow avoided altering the life force during the transformation, but then he spotted the first change. A tiny, seemingly inconsequential part of the image morphed from its original shape to a twisted and strange one of a different color. From there on, more and more changes started to appear one after the other until they numbered in the thousands. Even in such a large number, these changes barely registered more than 2% of the entire life force, which should demonstrate just how many details made up the life force of a person. 81,523 points of change spread throughout the entire life force. This is gonna take a while. Nick thought with a sigh before getting to work. Each symbol in the life force was a simply thing, much like a gear that needed many other parts to truly show its value. This thankfully made it a fairly easy matter to try and figure out what specifically they were part of. Most of the parts changed by the curse were in regards to the shape and function of the cells in the body that, when compounded with the ones that dictated the shape of the body, created the life force of a werewolf. These changes were not permanent thanks to the life force being built to find parts of itself not mixing well with the others and repairing them. These changes only last during the full moon, likely because that is the only time that the lunar energy is the highest, and after that the curse lacks the power to maintain these changes, so the werewolf transforms back into a normal person. Nick theorized. It explained why such a powerful magic might fail to be active constantly, which would make werewolves a lost cause and need them to be killed to stop the spread. I wonder, if I were to collect the light of the moon and present it to Lupin, would he immediately transform or not? Nick thought and immediately decided to test it. Saving the data he had received in the realm in a special memory vial, he left the realm. Tempus, he said while waving his wand to get the time at the moment. 7:35. I have time to collect some light before I ought to get some sleep, he thought before leaving the workshop and heading for the courtyard, since the astronomy tower was definitely being used at the moment. The courtyard, on the other hand, was probably very much empty. Most people wouldn't even consider being out there at night during winter from the sheer level of cold that they would be exposed to needlessly. Nick was not most people, however, and easily shrugged off the cold with a warming charm before he left the castle. The moon was waning away from full on this day, so while not as good as during a full moon, he could still collect the light in abundance. After setting a quick alarm around him in case someone came, Nick closed his eyes and extended his senses as per the method he had. Once he saw the light, he quickly and firmly began to weave the hand signs that drew out the light. Threads of magic came from his hands in an invisible manner that he could only see thanks to his current extended senses. It merely took him 5 minutes to extract a basketball-sized chunk of light material thanks to his constant replenishment of mana with every breath. This constant regain of energy meant he could actively pour more energy into the magic without worrying about running out. It was still a heavily energy-consuming task, but at least he could speed it up a little now. Once he was done, Nick removed his alarm and headed back into the castle for the night. He headed straight up to the common room to wait at that point, since dinner should be reaching its end and he didn't want to be woken up. The next day he woke up at dawn like usual and got dressed while casting a warming charm on himself to ward off the chill of the cold that had seeped into the dorm. It wasn't frigid by any means, but still less than optimal for a heat-driven creature like himself. The common room was not much better since the fire had gone out in the fireplace sometime during the night, so he placed a few more logs in from the pile next to the fireplace and lit them with a small jet of azure flames from his mouth. Chapter 338, Gifts. Nick had to admit he absolutely loved this ability, even though it didn't have much use to him. He was pretty sure it was the fascination with dragons that everyone has when they are young and or haven't seen one before. No matter how fierce or hideous the creatures are called by others, to a child dragons are plain cool. It's just how they were hardwired for some reason. That changed when the child grew up most of the time, or in the wizarding community's case actually saw a real dragon up close. It's rather hard to idolize something when it is actively trying to kill you, not impossible of course, but still difficult. Nick was no different really, as despite seeing Norberta up close, the dragon whelp didn't exactly frighten Nick with its constant avoidance of him. Still, the ability to breath fire was awesome and Nick refused to think otherwise. With the fireplace filled with a roaring fire, warmth quickly returned to the common room and the dorms connected to it. Nick didn't stick around, however, and made his way to the workshop to work on his Christmas gifts. Lupin had classes today, that meant he was going to be unavailable until they were over, giving Nick about 4 hours to kill. He didn't go to breakfast but ate some lembas bread instead, like he had found himself doing more and more recently. He couldn't help it since he was really on a tight time crunch to improve and complete several things all at once. He wasn't planning on getting everyone expensive or amazing gifts this year, as there was no point. Everyone who got a gift from him got a personalized gift based on them, but there was no reason it had to be over the top. For example, Hermione and Daphne were getting 2 handwritten books of nothing but enchantments, which they will undoubtedly use over the break. For Ron, he had a book on veritology he copied from Beau's batons, since the craft was his passion at the moment. Harry was getting the dagger made from sunlight Nick made previously. Tracy was getting a furnace with a cold fire seed and dragon flame seed pre-installed that he ordered secretly through the twins. It was a larger furnace, however, as he noticed she was more inclined to the pointy life-taking implements rather than jewelry like him. There was nothing wrong with that at all, since most craftsmen had a thing they were best at or focused their attention on. A good example of this was that Snape was able to brew almost any potion, but preferred instead to improve on those that already existed. For Luna, he was actually a little bothered, as he didn't know what specifically to get her, as she had a very eclectic set of preferences that covered a great many topics. In the end he settled for whatever a chunk of moonlight would become, since it was a gift based on her name. A bit lazy perhaps, but it was the best he could come up with on short notice. Nick was thankful that the light of the moon wasn't actually the same as its actual light. None of the light he collected was. It was simply magical energy saturated with that celestial object's influence condensed into a solid material. Even calling it light was scientifically incorrect, as it had absolutely nothing to do with actual light. Anyways, the stuff had an inclination for jewelry inherently, which was great, as he managed to condense a fist-sized chunk of it into a bracelet with a shiny glowing silver color and small white stones dotting it. The effect of the bracelet was most surprising as it granted a chameleon ability to whoever wore it that reminded Nick suspiciously of the metamorphagus gift. It was weak though, so it only allowed small changes like hair length, nose size, lip fullness, that sort of thing. It was an odd ability that fit Luna like a glove, making it perfect. All he had left at this point was gift-wise was the professors, Sirius, and the twins. Nick didn't have a very wide group that he regularly interacted with, so his list of people was still manageable. He put that off for later though, as classes finally ended and it was now time for him to test his theory on lunar energy. Lupin was not expecting Nick to show up today. How could he, considering the difficulty of the task he was working on? He was left even more dumbfounded when Nick started to explain why he was there as well as what he had learnt. These were groundbreaking discoveries in lycanthropy research, but Nick didn't seem to care at all and was insistent on testing a theory he came up with. Chapter 339, An Interesting Phenomena. It would be best if we speak to Dumbledore on this matter first, just in case this test of yours goes sideways. Lupin said seriously after he calmed himself to think rationally. If he were younger he may have agreed to the test outright eagerly without thinking about how it could go wrong, but after a life full of regrets brought about by doing exactly that, he had learned self-restraint the hard way. Nick frowned since he didn't want to bring the old goat into the matter, but he could agree that Lupin also had a point. He was using a fairly unknown form of magic in order to try and stimulate the werewolf curse in Lupin, so it was possible that the test would cause an unforeseen complication to appear. Fine then. We will speak to Dumbledore about this before deciding to push the test forward. Nick said in agreement. They left the office quickly after that and immediately headed to the headmaster's office, since neither thought Dumbledore would mind the interruption considering the nature of it. They were right as well, since the old man was expecting such an event to happen during the course of Nick's study on the topic. Fill me in on what you have discovered so far before we discuss the matter of this test you wish to perform. The old man said seriously. Nick honestly explained the details of what he had discovered from the samples he had taken from Lupin previously, as well as his theory on why the curse only activated on the 3 days of the full moon. Some of what he talked about confused Lupin greatly, but Dumbledore seemed to understand what he was referring to. It's clear to me that you have been quite thorough in your research on the topic. To the point in fact that you may be the only person with this deep of an understanding of the curse in the entire world. It is also my understanding that the light you collected from the moon is the purest condensed magic of it. Is that correct? Dumbledore spoke softly but with a seriousness that made it hard to lie. Nick nodded. That was why I wanted to see if my lunar energy theory was true. Of course the professor here will at most be exposed to a very small amount of the material, so if he transforms it is only for a short period. He said reassuringly. Dumbledore nodded. Very well then, you may give him the material while I watch on from the side. He said and stood up from his chair before holding his wand at the ready. Lupin looked nervous as Nick took the globe of material from his ring and carefully pinched off a tiny portion. The rest was placed within his realm again before Nick dropped the material into Lupin's hand. Immediately the material looked like it sank into his skin, but they all knew what really happened. The curse ate the energy. Lupin groaned for a moment as the curse started its activation pattern, but he stopped shortly afterwards when the jolt of lunar energy ran out and the curse was suppressed by his body again. All three of their eyes lit up at this as they understood that Nick's theory was correct and that the lunar energy merely served as fuel for the curse to be active. This meant that there was now a very easy solution to the problem that all werewolves faced. All that was needed was a way to protect their bodies from the lunar energy, and they would simply never transform again. It wasn't exactly a cure for the curse, but it was a far better method of treatment than the newly created Wolfsbane potion that only allowed them to retain their minds after transforming to a degree. The way it did this, however, was no better than eating poison to fight a disease, as the potion poisoned the wolf side of the werewolves, thus letting the human mind remain for the most part. That makes me wonder how the curse absorbs the energy exactly. Is it passive through the body or does it actively take it in? Nick pondered out loud, making Lupin nervous. It should be pointed out that Nick looked almost excited at the idea of testing this out in much the same way a mad scientist would. Perhaps it's best if we leave that matter alone, as it likely has little to do with helping Remus here. Dumbledore said softly but firmly. Nick was a bit disappointed but quickly recovered. With this I merely need some data from an animagus to compare with what I have before I can start working out a prototype enchantment. He said honestly. Chapter 340, Waiting Game. Lupin was quite shocked to hear this, but Dumbledore was not, since he understood that the depth of information Nick shared alone had plenty of workable points for fixing the magic. He knew the exact way the curse affected Lupin as well as the energy that fueled the magic. He even knew roughly how the curse was originally created and how to potentially strip it away from someone. With all of this information at his fingertips, it would honestly be more surprising if he wasn't close to being able to create a prototype enchantment. With all of that said though, Dumbledore also recognized that this was also a play to get more information on animagi magic for his own gains. That was perfectly fine in his opinion, as he had never intended for Nick to work without any self-benefit in this matter. The boy, for all of his genius, was very profit-driven and had only recently started to focus on helping others as well. I'm sure Sirius would be more than happy to help if we asked him, so long as we tell him what it's for. Lupin said, eagerly volunteering his friend. Nick said it didn't matter at all who the animagus was, so Sirius would work fine before they left after sending a letter to the man via Fox. I should finish up my gifts for Christmas since it is merely a waiting game at this point, Nick thought as he returned to the workshop. For Flitwick it was a simply matter of giving him a generous amount of light material to study, as it clearly interested him greatly. For McGonagall he instead created a quill out of one of Nazgul's shed feathers that he inlaid with mithril very carefully. The silver metal running down the center of the black, white, and golden feather gave it a sort of shine that appealed to the eyes greatly. He had quite a few of Nazgul's feathers, since as she grew she had to replace her older smaller ones with new larger versions. For Snape he forged a ladle that was enchanted to give detailed feedback to the person using it on the status of the potion. He had based this enchantment on both his understanding of potions and on his realm's analysis capabilities. Obviously it was nowhere as impressive, but still good enough to be of some use to the man in his chosen field. For Hagrid he ordered a pygmy drake from Aesop's Emporium that cost him a couple hundred galleons. Pygmy drakes were reptiles about the size of a house cat that were dragons in all regards except size and personality. Unlike dragons, they were not generally very aggressive or territorial unless trained to be such. At that point they were really good at guarding an area, since they tended to work in a group of 5 or more. Nick merely got the sort raised to be pets instead, since while Hagrid couldn't have an actual dragon he would still love something like this. For Dumbledore he simply got the man a dozen thick woolen socks just for the hell of it. Sirius on the other hand got a custom-made bracelet that was enchanted to get rid of the lingering effects of his long-term exposure to Dementors, as well as strengthen his body back to healthy levels. Even now, months after he had been released, the man was nowhere near recovered from the decade of malnutrition, spiritual rot, and illness. This gift would let him quickly reach full strength and even return to active combat against the Death Eaters that will no doubt be a problem soon. Finally done, Nick thought after he finished the bracelet. That was the last gift he needed to prepare. Checking the time he saw that it was only 6:32 and decided to go join the other students at dinner. His appearance in the Great Hall was met with a mix of jealousy and surprise, as word had spread throughout the student body of his exemption from classes by this point. The less intelligent or short-sighted of the students were jealous and thought it unfair. The others though had figured out that he had simply traded one for of study and work for another, as he was much more tired-looking and absent-minded when he was seen now. His friends in Gryffindor were supportive of him and made no mention of his exemption, as he had told them the terms of it and they knew he was truly working his hardest. Regardless of all else, they saw him smelt no less than 400 blank iron rings a day that he turned into rings of protection in varying amounts.